Hi there, I'm Paul Haberstrood. Welcome to The Cost of Living. Sometimes work can be a grind. That's why they call it work. But what happens when the grind tips over into something worse? Your boss is, well, a jerk. Like a for-real jerk. Coming up later in the show, practical strategies for escaping a toxic boss. Up first, Canada's economy is doing, let's call it, okay. Now, that's not especially remarkable, except weren't tariffs going to send us careening into a recession? So what happened? Remember how nervous we were back in the spring when Trump started threatening tariffs? Now, far be it from me to use corny sound effects, but some of the predictions were like, we were headed for fire, brimstone, a deep recession. So what happened? Not that much. We're not in a recession, and the economy is still eking out some growth. I asked Jean-François Perrault, Scotiabank's chief economist, if we could actually maybe be skating away from this.
Things have not been as bad as we feared. They're not great, but they have not been as bad as they feared. And that's a hard message to communicate, right? I mean, things aren't good. You say, well, they could have been a lot worse.
When Trump started talking tariffs, it was 25% across the board. But then there were delays, hemming, hawing, and finally exemptions.
What's occurred on the tariff side hasn't been nearly as aggressive as we feared it to be, right? You remember early on in the year, it was 25% tariffs on everything and maybe more. And the reality has been that we have seen a very significant chunk of our exports excluded from the tariffs because of the CUSMA exclusion.
Yep, CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. It replaced NAFTA around 5 years ago. And it's a free trade deal, so we thought we had free trade, but then it looked like Trump might toss it out the window. Well, that hasn't happened. CUSMA is still in effect. And goods covered under the deal are being exempted from tariffs. So that would seem to cover around 85 to 95% of our trade. It's tough to stick a pin in an exact number because everyone seems to use a slightly different one. Some businesses also haven't done the paperwork to get covered by the deal, so they're still feeling the hit from tariffs. But the main takeaway here is CUSMA to the rescue. A big chunk of our exports remain untouched. Now, the White House has separately imposed specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, the auto sector. And so when you average things out between what's tariffed and what's not, economists figure our overall tariff rate is around 5 or 6%.
Tariffs are no good, period. And a 5% tariff is way more harmful than a 0% tariff. There's no question about it. But, if at the end of the day we come out of this with 4 or 5% tariffs, and the Europeans have got 15, the Brits have got 10, the Japanese got 15, every other country's got more than that. We will remain in a deeply competitive position relative to potential trading partners into the U.S. given that advantage. So 5% is painful, but there is a legitimate argument to be made that this is it's maybe a least bad outcome.
Yeah, we're kind of getting off light. But light also doesn't mean scot-free. The businesses being targeted by those industry-specific tariffs, they're feeling it.
The unemployment rate in Windsor is almost 11%. And that's the highest in the country. And there's a reason it's the highest in the country. It's because that's the kind of the epicenter of the auto industry, and they're struggling. Right? You've seen shutdowns temporary. You've seen changed plans with respect to where they're going to do certain things. You've seen the steel industries struggle because of all this stuff. You've seen some steel companies ask for bailouts from the government. These are painful things for those industries. There's no question about it. No question.
So tariffs are definitely biting. But for now, the cuts are deep and narrow. And Jean-François says Canada's economy is big enough to absorb that pain.
I mean, the reality is that a lot of these things are going to be hyper-regional, right? You're shutting down a plant in the middle of BC or northern Quebec or New Brunswick. Extremely meaningful for those communities, but with, in a lot of cases, limited outside impacts. And also, 2/3 of our economy is service sector, right? We're not all about sending goods to the U.S. The economy is pretty diverse, both geographically and economically. And that's allowed us, I think, in part, to be a little bit more prosperous than we thought we were going to be earlier on this year.
Restaurants, tourism, lawyers, doctors, teachers, government workers, those kinds of service sector jobs aren't strapped to the whims of trade tariffs the same way as exporters. That has, in part, helped keep the country's economy afloat. It's on track to grow this year by 1%, maybe 1.5%. That's not exactly gangbusters. U.S. tariffs are dragging things lower. And then there's China. It just threw a doozy of a tariff at Canadian canola. But let's park that for a second. That's a whole other chapter. So what does all this mean for the economy? Normally, sluggish economic growth would mean lower interest rates. But right now, tariffs are also causing inflation to perk up. So maybe we get a 1/4 point cut this year, or, sorry mortgage holders, maybe we don't. When Jean-François takes it all in, tariffs, inflation, how does he feel about where things could be heading?
Cautiously optimistic.
Okay, cautious optimism. We'll take it, especially in the face of 35% tariffs. Ah! A part of Jean-François' optimism comes from how Canada is responding to tariffs. The country seems to be coming together, looking at how we can do things differently. The feds are talking about building big things. Provinces are looking at breaking down interprovincial trade barriers. We're diversifying, finding new markets for our stuff. Our trade with non-U.S. countries is at a record high.
We're probably going to be revising our forecast over the medium term up at some point. We're not ready to do that yet. But as we look to policy developments and the traction that they may have in Canada and the seriousness of the effort that's being deployed again by all levels of government is probably going to lead us to think more positively about our economy, maybe next year, the year after that, over a longer period of time.
Of course, there is one big caveat.
I'm still very mindful of the fact that President Trump is President Trump and that he will say and do things that will be a challenge for Canadians, for Americans, for others around the world. There'll be a CUSMA renegotiation presumably at some point. God knows what that's going to involve. Hopefully not much like it did last time, but maybe something more substantial.
That CUSMA renegotiation is scheduled to happen next July. And who knows, Trump may try to crack open the deal even earlier, so our tariff reprieve may not last forever. In the meantime, Jean-François expects to hear a lot of saber-rattling out of the White House, but he says that can also just start to sound like noise.
We're just kind of getting used to the silliness. Right? There's a lot, he says a lot of things, a lot of those things are designed to scare folks, and they work. But maybe there's kind of a Peter cried wolf thing going on, which is, at some point, you just start to get on with your life a little bit.
Just a refresher on the boy who cried wolf. At the end of the fable, the boy gets eaten by the wolf. Huh. This is The Cost of Living. Listen to us on CBC Radio 1 or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Paul Habersrud. We all know how it feels when your alarm goes off. You hit snooze. You hit snooze again because you really don't want to go to work. But what if it's just not, a case of the Mondays? What if work feels like torture and the tormentor is your boss? In the latest installment of our summer How-To series, we asked Laura Hambley Lovett what to do. She's the author of the upcoming book, I Wish I'd Quit Sooner, practical strategies for navigating and escaping a toxic boss.
So a toxic boss is characterized by either covertly or overtly doing things that harm people's engagement, productivity, and well-being. So covert things are behind the scenes, like manipulation and taking credit for your work behind your back, dishonesty. And then overt behaviors are the behaviors that are outwardly aggressive. And those include things like abusive behavior, bullying, and gaslighting, which is one of the areas that a toxic boss can unfortunately get into. And this happens to senior executives. There's one senior executive I quote in my book where she was off work with an injury. So she had a surgery, and the toxic boss called 2 days later, saying, you're still able to be on a computer. Even though your legs are up, you're still able to be on a computer. Where are you? So you discovered you have a toxic boss. Now, what do? There's different ways to manage. There is shifting your psychological contract, and that's a term we use in organizational psychology to say you have a written contract with your employer, but you also have a psychological one, which is what I give and what I get in return. So if you know you have a toxic boss, maybe you reframe it and say, this is just a period of time and I'm just doing a job and I'm just going to put my head down and do my work while looking for another job in every spare moment I have. Or file a complaint. You file a formal complaint to HR. There's pros and cons. There's always risks. But sometimes that's the very best option for you. And sometimes it can lead to that toxic boss being investigated. And if multiple people are feeling the same way, especially, it can result in the toxic boss being let go, which is the best possible outcome. But the flip side of that is when you put yourself out there, you make that claim and it doesn't lead to change and it makes your situation worse. And at the worst, I have case studies in my book where people got severanced out after making that complaint. So they got laid off without cause, but they knew what the cause was. And it was horrible for them, but it was a light at the end of the tunnel because they look back and say, I'm sure glad that happened. It was the worst period of my life, and I'm so glad to be on the other side of that and that I was packaged out. Are toxic bosses being talked about more? Yes. And the youngest generation especially, they don't stay long. So if they're reporting to a toxic boss, they're much more likely to quit sooner. And so that's interesting because I think they grew up more with those anti-bullying messages and not tolerating abuse. So that younger generation saying, no, I'm not putting up with that. So it's the older you are relatively, the more likely you are to have grinned and bared it. And the longer you stay, the more they're going to damage you. And the only way is out. And I know that's difficult for some people to hear, but there are different ways to do that, to navigate your career, to get back in the driver's seat of your career.
Laura Hambley Lovett is the author of I Wish I'd Quit Sooner, Practical Strategies for Navigating and Escaping a Toxic Boss. That's all for the show. The Cost of Living is based in Calgary. The show is produced by Danielle Nerman, Blair Sanderson, Leah Hendry, and Jennifer Keane, with help from Jeff Kynock. I'm Paul Haversrud. Thanks for listening.